Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 552, The Road Less Traveled. Despite primarily being a history teacher, I've taught classes across the humanities covering everything from geography to philosophy, and I've even taught a bit of literature, which has given me some occasion to think about the idea of a literary canon. Not canon as an artillery, mind you, but canon as in a collection of famous or noteworthy works. You see, a lot of the teaching of literature today is still defined by the idea of quote-unquote canonical literature, that there are certain works you should be exposed to in formative years because of their cultural influence or importance, or because they're widely celebrated, or for some other reason like that. If you grew up in the United States and were made in high school to read, say, The Scarlet Letter or The Great Gatsby, the fact that they are commonly treated as canonical works of American literature is why. And I admit to having a complex relationship with the idea of a literary canon. There are some works that certainly are so influential that any educated person should be at least a little familiar with them. In the English language, I would name the works of Shakespeare or the Bible as examples, and there are a few others you could include there as well, depending on how you defined the idea of influence or importance. But beyond that pretty narrow band of works, I can't help but think of a conversation on this subject that I had with Demetria, my lovely wife. You see, she pointed out to me that from a historical perspective, teaching the historical canon gives us a very skewed notion of life in a given historical era. I mean, think of today. What percentage of readers are going around reading the latest and greatest works of high literature, the texts that get all the prestigious literary awards? Some certainly do read those books, but everyone knows that popular works are just, well, more popular. Statistically, far more people are reading lighter, mass-market stuff, and to be clear, there is nothing wrong with that. It's important to realize that that is not a new historical dynamic. It's not like once upon a time we all read highbrow literature and gazed off into the distance as we contemplated the moral and spiritual lessons therein. For most of human history, arguably all of human history, readers have preferred the pulpy and entertaining to the edifying and groundbreaking. To put this more concretely, if you imagine what you're likely to read in a class on, say, early 20th century British literature, it's probably going to be something like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway or James Joyce's Ulysses. This despite the fact that if you actually want to understand what most British readers were engaging with in the early 20th century, you probably shouldn't be reading either of those. You should be reading Sherlock Holmes. To really understand a period's literary output, then, you should go outside the canon and look at mass-market literature, at what regular people were actually reading most of the time. And as an aside, when it comes to Japanese literature and its history, I do find that English language academia is generally better about including a wider range of actually popular literature in survey courses on the Tokugawa years. Maybe that's because if you grow up in an English-speaking part of the world, you don't have some of the same class-based prejudices about Japanese literature that you might take into a subject a bit closer to home. Maybe that's because literature from the Tokugawa years is so defined by the mass-market appeal. But that question is not exactly what we're going to talk about today. What I want to talk about instead is one of the most popular writers of the golden age of Tokugawa mass-market literature, someone whose work was incredibly popular in his day, but who you probably have never heard of unless you are very interested in the literature of Edo period Japan. His name was Shigeta Sadakazu, but if you go looking for books attached to that name, you're not going to find very much. That's because, like many educated folks in the Edo period, he was referred to by many different names over the course of his life. One of those, his chosen pen name, is the one that is actually famous, Jippensha Iku. Now, in a certain sense, we have a lot of pretty good documentation of Jippensha's early life, and by the way, I'm going to refer to him using his pen name from this point forward, because again, it's just the name that is famous. It's the one you'll find if you actually go looking for his work. Anyway, our documentation of his life largely comes from his own writings and recollections, many of which, as we'll see, were intended to be entertaining first and foremost, and so it's hard to be totally sure what's true and what's not. Still, the broad strokes are pretty uncontroversial. The future Jippensha Iku was born in 1765 to a family of samurai living in Suruga Province, today a part of Shizuoka Prefecture, along the Pacific coast of Honshu. His father was a petty official in the local government. The part of Shizuoka they lived in was Tenryo, land owned directly by the shogun, and he was part of the shogun's bureaucracy. His father also had enough connections to secure his young son a spot in a nobleman's house in Edo from a young age. Being brought up in Edo was of course a good way for a young samurai to secure connections to the influential and powerful that could serve him well later in life. And this apparently worked pretty well. Upon attaining his adulthood, Jipensha worked first in the same local administration as his father, and then eventually secured a job in Osaka. The precise date of his move to that city is one of many things I've had a hard time confirming. The main source I'm relying on for this episode says 1791, but I've heard others say as early as 1783, though that seems way too early. Regardless, they all agree on the job, an assistant to one of the two Osaka city magistrates, specifically the eastern magistrate, Odagiri Naotoshi. Odagiri, one of the shogun's hatamoto or direct bannermen, would serve in Osaka until 1792, once his rotation as one of the two city magistrates was up. But Jipensha was retained by his successor, Sakabe Hirotaka, for at least a couple of years. All told, Jipensha Iku would spend 6 or 7 years in Osaka, again the timeline is not totally clear, working for the city magistrate's office in the daily administration of affairs in one of the nation's most important cities, and one of the only ones that was really dominated by the culture not of the samurai, but of the townsmen, which will be important later. It was also during this time that Jipensha Iku got married for the first of 3 times. The first 2 marriages were arranged as part of an adoption, merchant families that didn't have a son to take over the business, and so married their daughters to a man who could be adopted to lead it. In both cases, apparently the marriages did not prove happy, and before he returned to Edo, he would arrange for them to be dissolved. He would later marry a 3rd time and this one lasted, but from what I can tell, he never really wrote much of anything about his wife or their relationship, so there's not really much to go on at all there. It's also likely that somewhere in here Jipensha Iku took up literature for the first time. Why exactly he developed an interest in writing is, again, not totally clear. Maybe he wanted to make some extra money. His attempts to arrange marriages into business families certainly suggest a desire for extra income, and we know that by the late 1700s, inflation meant that government salaries were not exactly the best way for samurai to make a living. Or maybe he was just a goofy guy who'd been born into a samurai social class that was very self-serious, and needed some sort of creative outlet to avoid losing his mind. We just don't know. What we do know is that by the time he returned to Edo in the mid-1790s, again I've seen dates as early as 1794 and as late as 1798, he does seem to have been writing at least part-time. We have a bunch of his humorous pieces from this period, by which point he is using the pseudonym Jipensha Iku. That name, by the way, is intended to be a reference to his own past. Sarakazu, his adult personal name, was not taken until the time of his Genpuku, a sort of coming-of-age ceremony for samurai. Before then, he was known by a childhood name, Ichiku, and of course Iku is just a shortening of that. Jipensha, meanwhile, is essentially just a nonsense phrase derived from that most classic source of Japanese humor, the nonsense kanji pun. Apparently, the 3 characters used in it are homophones for characters connected to the incense trade, which is one of the other various types of businesses Jipensha Iku had turned to at one point to try and make a little extra money. Anyway, Jipensha Iku would, for the first few years of his literary career, be just one among a chorus of writers looking to make it big in the nation's capital of Edo, the center, of course, of a massive literary world buoyed by a growing urban population and a spiking literacy rate. His main specialty was the production of what you could call illustrated stories, not full-on comics, but written narratives interspersed with drawings to give some sense of the action. This is a genre that went by a few different names during this period, most notably Kibyoshi or Yellow Books, and Golkan or Combined Volumes, and we're not going to spend too much time parsing the distinctions between these genres, because those terms are constantly evolving and changing during this period, and that would be an episode in its own right. What's important for us is that for the first few years of his literary career, Jippensha was but one of a host of would-be authors, but in 1802, he finally had his breakout hit, when he released the work he is still most famous for, Tokaidochu Hizakurige. The Tokaido, of course, is one of the so-called Gokaido, or five highways, the main thoroughfares connecting the capital of Edo to the far-flung provinces. The Tokaido was the foremost among these five highways, the busiest and most famous, running from Edo along the Pacific coast to Kyoto all the way to Osaka. Now, of course, it's connected by roads and bullet train lines, but it's still one of the nation's main connecting arteries. The chu at the end of Tokaido just means along or among, so Tokaidochu is just along the Tokaido Road. Hizakurige is a bit harder to translate. It literally means knee chestnut horse, and was a euphemism essentially for walking. It's similar in origin to the British English phrase Shank's mare or Shank's pony, also used to refer to walking. So you sometimes see Hizakurige translated as Shank's mare or Shank's pony. I'm not going to do that because I'm American, and those phrases mean literally nothing to me here in Freedom Country. Anyway, the Tokaidochu Hizakurige was a breakout hit. It's also the main focus of our episode today, but I'm not going to start talking about it yet, because I want to talk through Jippensha Ikku's career after this point before we do that. Still, it would be hard to explain what came next without at least a little bit of discussion of what this book's actually about. So, Hizakurige is, in essence, a type of travel narrative. It follows two main characters, commoners named Yajirobe and Kitahachi, usually just Yaji and Kita for short, as they venture from Edo across the Tokaido to Osaka. There's no particular reason given for their travels in the narrative, though Jippensha does offer one for us to accompany them along it. Quote, "Now is the time to visit all the celebrated places in the country and fill our heads with what we have seen, so that when we become old and bald, we shall have something to talk about over the teacups." Which, I mean, yeah, fair enough, that's as good a reason to travel as I can think of. Both Yaji and Kita are described as, well, again, maybe it's best to let the author himself describe his characters, so here is how they are introduced in the text. Quote, "Theirs is the easy life of the bachelor. No more than the rats are they required to waste money on rent, and as all the property they have is tied up in a bundle, they have no anxiety about that. It is true that they had to make a small offering of rice at the family temple, and besides that, pay 100 coppers to get a traveling permit. Moreover, instead of paying what they owed to the landlord, they had to get their papers to pass the barriers. However, they made some money by selling to a second-hand dealer what they had of value, leaving the rubbish in the house for the next tenant to return thanks for. The stone weight for the pickle tub and the knife for scraping the pots and pans they left next door, and the house opposite got the torn sunshades and the oil jar. Nothing is left, but there is still the difficulty of paying the rice bill and the sake bill. They are very sorry to go away without paying them, but then, as the old poem says, whether in this life or the next, we cheat, in either case our punishment will meet." They are, in a word, troublemakers, and a good chunk of their adventure across the Tokaido involves scamming people, pursuing sex, or getting drunk, or all of these at the same time. Frankly, it's probably the brazen, over-the-top nature of Yaji and Kita as characters, their likable nature as scoundrels, that made Hizakurige into a hit, or at least that's a big part of it. The first volumes of the text came out in 1802, and they were published serially until 1809, when our pair of ne'er-do-wells finally made it to Osaka. But of course, the thing with any breakout hit is that before long, the inevitable conversation will happen. Is there some way we can keep this franchise going to milk it basically forever? And so it was that in 1810, Kita and Yaji made their way to Shikoku's Konpira Shrine, a major pilgrimage site in what's now Kagawa Prefecture, and thus a tourist destination with lots of businesses catering to those tourists. The next year, they continued along the inland seacoast of Shikoku to Miyajima and its famous Itsukushima Shrine. The year after that, in 1812, Jippensha Ikku sent his protagonists on another epic journey, this time along the Kisokaido Road. This was another of the Gokaido highways, but a bit less known than the Tokaido. It's sometimes also called the Nakasendo. It runs through the central spine of Honshu. That's a less populous area and a less popular road, But what are you gonna do? You burned your best road for the original. Honestly, just poor planning for the long-term health of the franchise. This new adventure took 10 more years to finish. In the interim, Jupensha also put out an introduction to the whole series, giving essentially origin stories for Kita and Yaji, who at this point had become iconic characters in the landscape of Edo popular literature, and of course, as we all know, a good prequel is a great way to milk a franchise. Honestly, even a bad prequel will do it sometimes, and that's probably for the best, because one gets the impression that by this point, Jupensha's heart wasn't really in it. At least he didn't keep very good notes, because the introduction he wrote has a bunch of errors in it that contradict the existing continuity of previously given information. For example, Jupensha decided to make his leads not native Edoites, but provincials who'd come to the big city looking for a job. Which is certainly fine, but he describes them as being from Fuchu in Suruga province, the same place Jupensha Ikku had been born. And our two heroes had been there in Tokaidochu Hizakurige and acted as if they never visited this town before. Yaji's backstory also has one hell of a continuity error. The introduction describes him as leaving Edo after divorcing his childless wife, but in the original text, Yaji's marriage ended after his wife died, but not before the two of them had children. Maybe Jupensha Ikku decided that Yaji was a bit too unsympathetic if he was a deadbeat dad. After 1822, Jupensha Ikku would leave his famous franchise behind for 8 years. He would not return to it until 1830, and probably for that most classic of reasons, financial issues. The previous year, Edo had been ravaged by one of its many great fires, the Great Fire of Bunsei, which killed 2,800 people and burned about 37,000 buildings. It was probably in order to rebuild his own home that Jupensha began a new series of Kita and Yaji adventures, this time entirely in Edo as the lovable rapscallions had finally returned home. However, this one would never be finished. While working on the second part of the text, Jupensha Ikku took ill in the summer of 1831 and died a month later at the age of 67. Now, there's a bit more I want to say about the author before we move on from him to talk about the text. And just to be upfront, we're only going to talk about Tokaidochu Hizakurige and not the sequels, because to this day, it's still the most famous of the set. In particular, I want to talk about what we know about Jupensha Ikku himself and his personality. And in a certain sense, we know quite a bit, but in another, not so much. What I mean by that is that most of the information we have about Jupensha Ikku comes from a dubiously reliable source, namely Jupensha Ikku. The famous storyteller loved to tell stories about himself, which included several anecdotes about himself in works beyond Hizakurige, which is great, but it also means we have to be a bit dubious. After all, people lie about themselves as much as they want, if they are the ones writing the story. Indeed, I can't help but get the impression that Jupensha Ikku actually thought of himself as a sort of character in his own right. There's actually a moment in the Osaka part of Hizakurige when Kita and Yaji sneak their way into the home of a wealthy merchant by the most clever of means. Yaji pretends to be Jupensha Ikku, who is in Osaka doing research to write Hizakurige. Kita, if you are wondering, assumes the role of his best and entirely fictitious pupil, Ipensha Nanryo. The two get caught when they are pressed by a mob for a demonstration of their literary talents, and Kita prefers a poem that one of the crowd recognizes as being ripped off from another famous poet. They bluster their way out of this by means of a distracting Who's on First style comedy routine involving increasingly elaborate kanji puns on the pronunciation of numbers. I swear it's funnier than it sounds, only to be decisively foiled when the master of the house gets word that the actual Jupensha Ikku has been spotted elsewhere in town. Anyway, what I'm getting at is that Jupensha Ikku was not above thinking of himself as a sort of character, a brand you could even say, that was as much a part of what he was selling as the actual stories were. Tales of his wackiness abound. One involved him tricking a friend, or in some tellings, his publisher, on New Year's Eve. You see, part of a traditional New Year's involved dressing up in your finest attire and making social calls on your inner circle, but Jupensha Ikku had no finest clothes to do this in. So he tricked his publisher into coming over and taking a bath at his house for some reason, and then stole his publisher's nice clothing to do the proper ceremonial visits. Another story involved wearing a bathtub on his head and walking around town just to see what people would say. Yet another involves him living a life of austere poverty, really because he didn't make enough money to support his dissolute lifestyle, and so decorating his home with pictures of nice furniture rather than the real thing, and even giving offerings to the gods of illustrations of the nice things he would have actually liked to offer them, but sorry, there's no money for it. My personal favorite involved a wish left behind in his will that when his body was cremated, a standard part of a Buddhist funeral, it would be secretly packed with fireworks so that when the fire was lit, hilarity would ensue. Honestly, I really like that one. Way to go out with a literal bang. However, there are some doubts about how true these stories are. One of his companions recalled going on a trip with the writer and expecting to be hilariously entertained by all his sharp-witted observations, only to find him very reserved in person. And certainly, if you look at the best-known portrait of Jipensha Ikku, he doesn't really look like a very funny guy, actually a pretty somber one. Meanwhile, some of the little narratives from his life are actually plagiarized from existing joke books. The one about the firework funeral, for example, is an older joke that Jipensha Ikku's fans appear to have just stolen and told about him after his death. One gets the impression, reading Hizakurige, that humor might not have been the main goal, but rather a way of getting across some social critique that otherwise might have fallen afoul of the shogun's censors. Because there is absolutely an element of social criticism in what Jipensha Ikku writes about. Quite a few of the bumbling misadventures of Yaji and Kita also involve unmasking the dishonesty, foolishness, and shortcomings of others. One of the most common critiques, perhaps to be expected given Jipensha's origins in the samurai class, is of his fellow warriors. He seems to have been very irritated by what he saw as the excessive self-regard of many of his fellow samurai, their arrogance towards commoners based on nothing more than inherited status. And as an aside, while Jipensha Ikku never technically stopped being a samurai, he also lived during a period where there were a lot more members of that class than there were jobs in the government for them. After his stint in Osaka, there's nothing I could find about him taking any official posting, and I'm not even clear on whether his rank was high enough to net him anything beyond the most perfunctory of stipends. Certainly, he doesn't seem to have had much of an interest in the warrior tradition or Confucianized moral pontificating. One suspects that as his life went on, he was less and less inclined to identify with the class to which he supposedly belonged. To give an example of all of this, very early on in the original Hizakurige, as the pair are departing Edo, Yaji and Kita encounter a daimyo's procession. This would of course be a daimyo and a group of his followers marching to the capital city as part of the process of Sankin Kotai, the alternating attendance system where you spend 1 year attending to the shogun and 1 year in your domain. These processions, of course, were intended to be reflective of the status of the lord being transported, a chance to show off your wealth and power. Here's what Yaji and Kita have to say about it. Quote, "They had paid for their meal and were just starting off when they saw a daimyo's procession coming from the opposite direction. The running footmen in front were an old man of 60 and a boy of 14 or 15. Both of them were inn servants. 'Down, down,' cried one of the footmen. 'Off, those with headgear. Those with head covered don't have to squat down, it seems,' said Kita. 'Why?' asked Yaji. 'Because he set off with them,' answered Kita. 'Postboy, hold that horse's mouth,' called the footman. 'How's he going to hold the mouth of the horse?' said Kita. 'Hee. 'That man behind is not bending low enough,' went the footman. 'Does he mean me?' asked Yaji. 'Of course I'm not low enough. You couldn't expect it of one as tall as Kumonryo on Otago Hill.' 'Don't make fun of them,' said Kita, 'or you'll get them angry.' 'Look,' said Yaji, 'aren't those fine fellows? See how regularly their clothes are folded and how they keep in line? I know what they're like. They're like an airing of clothes in Yoshicho.' 'Hello,' said Kita. 'Look at the helmets of those fellows with the bows. They look as though their heads were swollen. And look at the length of their cloaks,' cried Yaji. 'You can see their what-do-you-might-call-ems peeping out.' 'He's a fine fellow, the lord,' said Kita. 'I expect he's a great man with the maids.' 'There you go meddling with things you don't know anything about,' replied Yaji. 'You don't suppose people of that sort would stoop so low, do you?' "Why not?" said Kita. "There you are, look at him, see how erect he is. Come on, we can go now that he's gone." That's right, the whole thing is an elaborate setup for a dick joke. There's a few other moments like this throughout the text. In one, Yaji and Kita swindle a provincial samurai with more money than sense into buying a cheap leather coin purse for 100 coppers by feeding him a sob story about being robbed. They know he's a soft mark because he goes into a tea house at 2 p.m. and starts spending lavishly on sake. In another, Yaji tries to fake being a member of the samurai class by sticking an empty hilt into a scabbard alongside a dagger, and thus appearing to have the two swords that mark someone as a member of the class, in order to get out of paying a ferryman for having to cross a river. Which was a solid enough plan, except that A, the two of them were very obviously not traveling in the style expected of a samurai, and B, midway through the ruse, Yaji bumps into a tree and his empty scabbard bends, showing there's nothing inside. In the end, the two of them are forced to laugh it off, cut their losses, and pay for a different ferryman to take them across. What I'm getting at here is that there's not a lot of respect for the dignity and honor of the warrior class or any of that jazz. In fact, being a working writer, Jippensha Ikku did produce a lot of work that had nothing to do with Hizakurige, and one of those texts, the Bakemono Taiheiki, a retelling of some classic warrior tales with the main characters portrayed as demons, was banned by the government of the Tokugawa shoguns shortly after its publication in 1804. What was the crime, you ask? Insufficiently reverent portrayals of figures from the past of the samurai class, most notably Toyotomi Hideyoshi. In punishment for his lack of reverence, Jippensha Ikku actually had his hands chained together for 50 days so he could not write, delaying the production of the next volume of Hizakurige in the offing. Guess the Edo City magistrates were not fans. What I'm getting at here is that Jippensha Ikku had no real reverence for the class he grew up in, and in fact seemed rather invested in pointing out the many ways in which Edo period samurai were venal, self-obsessed, materialistic, and all the other things that an austere warrior and Confucian gentleman was not supposed to be. Maybe his up-close experience living as a samurai had disillusioned him. Or as he lived more and more around commoners, maybe his views changed. Or maybe he was just a businessman who understood that most of his customers were not samurai. They were townsmen, merchants, and artisans in the cities who didn't have a particularly high opinion of their samurai overlords. It's hard to be sure. It does seem pretty clear to me that Jippensha Ikku had a high enough opinion of some things, though. In a search of my digital copy of Hizakurige, you find the word sake appearing over 240 times, an average of slightly more than once every other page. Yaji and Kita spend a lot of their time talking about drink or getting drunk or paying for all the bills for the drinks they've drunk, or not. They also skip out on their bills pretty regularly. Similarly, women and sex are a constant preoccupation. Yaji and Kita are of course both described as bachelors, even if Yaji may or may not have children by a wife who is either divorced or dead, or possibly both, I guess. Speaking of which, many of the women they come across are described as just as cunning and capable as they are. There's one particularly fantastic moment where, along the road, the two men encounter a group of women traveling alone, staying in a room right next to theirs in the same inn. Of course, the two men introduce themselves, presumably planning to flagrantly hit on the women, but change their plans, at least for a time, when the women reveal themselves to be spirit mediums, experts in channeling the dead. Yaji then decides to hire one of them to channel his dead, but I guess at this point not yet divorced, wife. This goes, well, I'll just quote some of the stuff the medium says to him while channeling his wife. Quote, "I shall never forget it. When you were ill, you gave your sickness to me. Our only child who had to carry on our name grew weak and thin because there was no rice to fill his empty stomach. Every day, the duns were knocking at the door, and the rent remained unpaid, yet I did not complain, not even when I slipped in the dog's dirt in the lane. And then, when through my labors I had saved enough money to buy a kimono, I had to pawn it for your sake and never saw it again. Never again did it come back to me from the pawnbrokers. It is true that by the help of your friends you erected a stone over my grave, but you never go near it, and you never contribute to the temple to get the priests to say prayers for my soul. I am nothing to you. The stone over my grave has been taken away and put into the wall, where all the dogs come and make water against it. Not a drop of water is ever placed on my grave. Truly in death we suffer all sorts of troubles. But thus while you treat me in neglect, lying in my grave, I think of nobody but you, and long for a time when you will join me in the underworld. Shall I come to meet you?" Shockingly, Yaji is not interested in that reunion. Instead, he and Kita have drinks and dinner with these women, who, by the way, are pretty obviously conning them, given that the last request made by Yaji's dead wife while she's being channeled is to, quote, "give this witch plenty of money," unquote. That's not all he gives her, though. As dinner goes on and Kita and Yaji get increasingly drunk, they again start aggressively hitting on the youngest of these women, while her mother in turn hits on them. This all culminates in a classic bit of comedy where the two groups go to sleep in their neighboring rooms. Yaji decides to sneak over to the other one in the middle of the night, and is able to, quote, realize his desire with the young spirit medium, but before he can leave, he's accosted by an unknown figure, which turns out to be Kita, who'd been planning to do the exact same thing. Unclear who is who in the dark, the two men end up making out with each other for a time before they realize what's up. There's a lot more bits like this throughout the text, and honestly, they generally hold up pretty well. I'd put Tokaidochu Hizakurige up there with works like those of Kobayashi Issa in terms of being genuinely entertaining Edo literature, and the English language translation by Thomas Satchel is honestly very entertaining. To avoid spoiling anything else here, if you've been having fun with this episode, honestly, give it a look. It's really a good time. 3 years after Jipensha Iku's death, his friends and family erected a monument in the vicinity of Chomeiji in Edo's Mukojima neighborhood, a bit removed from his actual grave, which is at Zenryuji in Asakusa. That monument has Jipensa's personal seal, a bamboo rake with the character for Sada in Sadakazu on it, and beneath it a poem composed by the man himself. Here's Satchel's translation of it, quote, "However novel and interesting things may appear at first, when they become common they lose their interest. But the things of which people never tire are bright moonlight nights and dinner, to which may be added a book and sake. My allotted span of life has passed, oh, give me peace and rest at last." And so we'll give him his peace and return to where we started. I think Hizakurige is a great read for a few different reasons, but also importantly it gives us a window into the culture of the Edo period that would not be available to us if we focused on more classically elite literature. Hizakurige is not, of course, a one-to-one representation of daily life in Edo, Japan. Not everyone, unfortunately, was a drunk womanizing con artist. But it is a great window into what people in the Edo period found entertaining and funny, and it turns out it's largely the same stuff we find entertaining and funny. In history, you often encounter a lot of reminders about different values in past cultures. I'm reminded of that pithy phrase that the past is a foreign country, they do things differently over there. And that's certainly true in some ways, but in others, it's really worth remembering that our ancestors were not that different from us. They too liked a good laugh, and really, what's funnier than a funeral ending in a good fireworks show? That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com. Special thanks to our patrons, Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John Christopher Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japanesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, Brenner Podgurski Smith, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Special thanks also to new patron Joshua for donating to support the History of Japan Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the first part of a 2-part series that I bet will get me some really interesting hate mail on the history of Reiki.